In 43 years of marriage, Margaret Blackwood taught me that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. Strangers have to earn your trust first. Family already owns the key. My name is Richard Blackwood. I was 71 years old in October of 1987, and by then, I had spent nearly half a century building Blackwood Coastal Holdings, from one neglected boarding house in Newport into a real estate empire stretching from Rhode Island to Boston. People said I had built it for myself. They were wrong. I built it because I believed one day my children would inherit something better than the life I started with. I had no idea that belief would become the weapon used against me. 9 months before this story began, my wife Margaret died on a rain-soaked section of Ocean Drive, less than 4 miles from our home. The police called it an accident. Her Mercedes missed a curve, broke through a stone barrier, and struck a tree. No witnesses, no second vehicle. No reason to suspect anything except bad weather and terrible luck. Margaret was 67. 6 hours earlier, she had eaten dinner across from me and complained about the roses dying too early that year. Then she kissed my cheek and left for a charity committee meeting. At 2:14 the next morning, a state trooper stood in my front hall holding his hat against his chest. After 43 years together, I became a widower in the time it took a stranger to say my name. There was only one thing Margaret left behind that I could still touch without feeling as if someone had emptied the air from the room. Her 1962 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. Pearl gray, red leather interior, chrome bright enough to catch the afternoon sun. We bought it used 2 weeks before our wedding, back when buying a Rolls-Royce was an absurd decision for a young couple still counting every dollar. We left our wedding reception in that car. We brought our son Daniel home from the hospital in it. Years later, Margaret drove our daughter Claire to her first day of school behind the same wheel. After Margaret died, I stopped driving it. I kept it covered in the rear garage at Blackwood Manor because sitting inside it felt too much like sitting beside a ghost. Then on Monday morning, October 12, I opened the garage door and found an empty space. The Rolls was gone. The fitted cover had been folded neatly on the workbench. No broken lock, no forced door, no shattered glass. Whoever had taken the car had used a key. Only 3 people knew where the spare was kept. Our groundskeeper Walter, me, and my son Daniel. I called Daniel's house. No answer. His office told me he had taken the week off. When I finally reached him, airport announcements echoed behind his voice. Dad, bad time. Where are you? Kennedy. Vanessa and I are flying to Paris. I stared at the empty garage. Where is your mother's Rolls-Royce? For 2 seconds, Daniel said nothing. I sold it. I thought I had misheard him. You did what? Dad, don't turn this into some tragedy. Mom's been gone 9 months. The car was just sitting there. It was your mother's. It belongs to the family. It belongs to me. His voice hardened. Eventually, all of this is going to be mine anyway. I don't think Daniel understood what he had just said, but I did. For the first time in my life, I heard my son speak about my death not as a loss, but as a transfer of ownership. Why did you sell it? I asked. I needed cash for a property deal. How much? $5 million. The Rolls was worth perhaps $120,000. Daniel knew that as well as I did. He had spent 20 years around valuations, contracts, financing, and acquisitions. $120,000 could not solve a $5 million problem. The mathematics exposed the lie before his voice did. We'll talk when I get back, he said. Daniel. The line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, looking at the 4 pale marks on the concrete where the tires had rested. Daniel had taken a car he didn't own, sold it without asking me, and left the country before I could discover it. That wasn't a bad decision made in a moment of desperation. It had been planned. And if the money wasn't really for a property deal, then I needed to know what he was running from. At 11:43 that morning, the telephone in my study rang. A man introduced himself as Nathaniel Cole from Cole and Mercer Motor Auctions in Manhattan. Mr. Blackwood, we took possession of a 1,962 Silver Cloud from your son yesterday. I know. Then you're aware there's a problem with the title. The car is registered to me and my late wife. Silence. Then his voice changed. Sir, I think you need to come to New York. Why? Our mechanic removed the rear seat during inspection this morning. He found a leather envelope hidden beneath it. I stopped breathing. What's inside? A key, several photographs, a cassette tape, and a letter written to you. From whom? He hesitated. Your wife. I gripped the receiver. Margaret had been dead for 9 months. Nathaniel continued, almost whispering now. Mr. Blackwood, the first line says that if you're reading the letter, something has already gone terribly wrong. That was the moment I stopped believing my son had simply stolen a car, because Margaret hadn't hidden a memory inside that Rolls-Royce. She had hidden a warning. I was in Manhattan before sunset. Nathaniel Cole met me at the private storage floor beneath the auction house, 3 levels below a showroom filled with Ferraris, Bentleys, and polished machines owned by men who liked to believe money could keep anything from aging. Margaret's Rolls-Royce sat beneath fluorescent lights at the far end of the room, looking exactly as it had the last morning I saw it at Blackwood Manor. For one irrational second, I expected Margaret to step around the hood and tell me the entire thing had been a misunderstanding. Instead, Nathaniel led me to a steel work table. The leather envelope lay open beneath a desk lamp. Beside it were 6 Polaroid photographs, a brass bank key stamped with the number 317, a cassette tape, and a folded sheet of cream stationery with my name written across the front in Margaret's handwriting. I knew that handwriting better than my own. I had seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, building permits, Christmas labels, and 43 years of notes left beside the coffee pot. But seeing it there, 9 months after burying her, felt like being touched by a ghost. I haven't played the tape, Nathaniel said, and I only read enough of the letter to know it was meant for you. I nodded, but for several seconds I could not make myself reach for it. Finally, I unfolded the page. Richard, if you are reading this, then either I have failed to tell you what I found, or someone has made certain I never got the chance. Do not confront Daniel. Do not confront Arthur. Do not trust any document carrying my signature until you have checked it yourself. Take the key to Commonwealth Atlantic Bank on 5th Avenue. Ask for Box 317 under the name Margaret Ellison. Go alone. And Richard, whatever you discover, promise me you will not make the mistake we made with Claire. I stopped reading. Claire. My daughter's name had not been spoken inside Blackwood Manor for almost 4 years. Not because she was dead, because I had made her disappear from my life myself. Claire had been 32 when I accused her of stealing nearly $200,000 from a family investment account. The evidence had looked undeniable at the time. Documents bearing her signature. Transfers authorized from a bank branch near her Boston apartment. A cashier's check deposited into an account connected to a failed gallery she had been trying to save. She swore she had done nothing. Daniel said he had tried to protect her. Margaret begged me to wait before making a decision. I did not wait. I told Claire that if she could steal from her own family, she could live without it. She left that night and never came back. I had spent 4 years telling myself I had acted on facts. Margaret's letter suddenly made those facts feel much less solid. I read the final lines. The truth is larger than money. Daniel is not the only person involved, but I no longer know who is using whom. If anything happens to me, assume nothing, especially an accident. My hands went cold. Nathaniel must have seen something change in my face because he quietly stepped away. I read the last sentence again, especially an accident. Margaret's death had been ruled an accident. No investigation, no suspicion. Rain, a curve, a car against a tree. I folded the letter carefully and put it inside my coat. Where did you find this? I asked. Nathaniel showed me beneath the rear seat. Someone had cut a narrow cavity into the leather-lined panel and sealed it with upholstery clips. Margaret had hidden the envelope well enough that no one would find it without removing the seat completely. That told me 2 things. She had not hidden it in panic. She had planned where it would go, and she had chosen the Rolls because she believed it would remain in the family. Daniel selling the car had done the one thing Margaret probably never expected. It had exposed her secret. I drove directly to Commonwealth Atlantic Bank. The branch manager initially refused to discuss Box 317 until I placed the brass key on his desk and gave him Margaret's maiden name. His expression changed immediately. He excused himself and returned 10 minutes later with an older man from the bank's legal department. Mr. Blackwood, the lawyer said, your wife rented this box 22 months ago. She left written instructions that you were to receive access if you appeared with the key. Did she ever come here with anyone? I asked. The lawyer checked a log. 6 times. Always alone. The vault was 2 floors below street level. Box 317 was longer than I expected. Inside were 3 thick envelopes, photocopies of property records, bank statements, corporate filings, and a handwritten list of addresses. But what caught my attention first were the photographs. The same 6 Polaroids Nathaniel had found copies of in the car, only these were marked on the back with dates. Each photograph showed the same man leaving different bank buildings in New York, Boston, and Providence, Arthur Kane, my chief financial officer of 21 years. In 2 of the photographs, he was carrying a black document case I had given him for his 50th birthday. In another, he was standing beside Daniel outside a private bank in Boston. Margaret had written beneath that photograph. They told me Daniel was in Chicago that day. I sat down at the small viewing desk in the vault. Beneath the photographs was a stack of mortgage assignments involving properties owned by Blackwood Coastal Holdings. Hotels, retail buildings, waterfront parcels. Assets I knew had never been approved for refinancing. Yet, there were my company seals, Arthur's signature, Daniel's authorization, and Margaret's signature. I stared at hers longest. It looked perfect. That frightened me more than if it had looked false. The final envelope contained a handwritten summary in Margaret's precise script. Estimated unauthorized exposure, $47.8 million. Possible offshore movement. Arthur signing. Daniel involved. Unknown beneficiary. Richard may be next. I felt something in my chest tighten. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The property deal Daniel had mentioned at the airport had required $5 million. Suddenly I understood something even more disturbing. Daniel had not sold the Rolls because $120,000 could solve a $5 million problem. He had sold it because, in his mind, anything that belonged to this family already belonged to him. He had no idea Margaret had hidden anything inside it. His greed had done what Margaret herself had never managed to do while she was alive. It had placed her evidence directly into the hands of strangers who had no reason to protect him. And whatever Daniel believed Margaret had left behind, he had moved too late. I gathered the papers and called the one man outside my family I had trusted for nearly 30 years. Samuel Pierce, my attorney. He answered from home. Richard, I need you in New York tonight. What happened? I looked down at the photograph of Daniel standing beside Arthur outside the Boston bank. Margaret knew someone was stealing from the company. Samuel went silent. How much? Nearly $48 million. Another silence. Then I said the part that made my own voice sound unfamiliar. And before she died, she wrote that I should not assume her accident was an accident. Samuel did not answer for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Do not go home tonight. I looked toward the vault door. Why? Because if Margaret believed you might be next, then until we know who she was afraid of, Blackwood Manor may be the worst place in the world for you to sleep. Samuel Pierce arrived in New York a little after 10 that night, wearing the same charcoal suit he had probably put on that morning, his tie loosened, and his expression sharpened by the kind of concern lawyers usually try not to show their clients. We met in a private room above a restaurant on East 52nd Street, far enough from the bank that I could stop feeling as though every person who passed me on the sidewalk knew what was inside my coat. Samuel spread Margaret's papers across the table, one sheet at a time. He did not speak for nearly 20 minutes. That frightened me more than anything he could have said. Samuel had represented me since Blackwood Coastal Holdings was still small enough to fit its annual accounts into one metal filing cabinet. He knew every acquisition, every partnership, every lawsuit, every family trust. If there was a weakness hidden somewhere inside my company, he understood exactly where to look for it. Finally, he removed his glasses and said, "These mortgage assignments are real." I stared at him. "The transactions are real. The signatures may not be. Nearly $48 million in property cannot disappear without someone noticing. It didn't disappear. That's the point." He tapped one document. "Someone borrowed against assets you still own. The hotels are still standing. The tenants are still paying rent. On the surface, nothing changes. The debt sits behind the property, and if the payments are routed correctly, you may never see it until someone defaults or calls the loan. I looked again at Daniel's authorization beside Arthur Kane's signature. Then Arthur had access. Arthur had access to the books. Daniel had executive authority. Between the two of them, they could move a great deal before anyone asked questions. And Margaret? Samuel pointed to her signature. If this is forged, whoever did it had access to old contracts, bank forms, perhaps even personal correspondence. It's very good. I thought of Daniel telling me at the airport that everything would eventually belong to him anyway. For the first time, the sentence no longer sounded arrogant. It sounded operational. Samuel gathered the papers back into a folder. We need someone outside the company. Police? Not yet. If we walk into law enforcement with suspicions and incomplete records, word could travel before we know who is involved. You have 4 senior executives with authority over financial records. If even one of them is part of this, the evidence starts disappearing the minute subpoenas are mentioned. He gave me a name, Evelyn Cross, former federal financial investigator, private now, discreet, expensive, and, according to Samuel, incapable of being intimidated by wealthy men. She met us the next morning in a conference room at Samuel's Manhattan office. Evelyn was 45, compact, unsmiling, with dark hair cut just above her shoulders and a habit of reading documents without moving anything except her eyes. She spent an hour studying Margaret's files, then asked me a question no one else had. Who benefits if you die? I almost laughed at the brutality of it. My children. Both? Daniel and Claire. Equal shares? Not anymore. Evelyn looked up. I told her about Claire. 4 years earlier, after the alleged theft, I had reduced her share of the family trust to almost nothing and removed her from any future management role. Daniel was now positioned to inherit controlling interest in Blackwood Coastal Holdings. Evelyn did not react. She simply wrote something down. So if you died tomorrow, Daniel would effectively control the company. Yes. And if Margaret discovered unauthorized debt secured against company property, she could interfere with that. Yes. And she is dead. Samuel shifted in his chair. Careful. Evelyn did not look at him. I am being careful. She turned back to me. Mr. Blackwood, I am not saying your son killed your wife. I am saying the financial incentive exists, the opportunity may exist, and your wife herself warned you not to assume her death was accidental. That is enough to investigate. Hearing the words spoken aloud made something inside me recoil. A father can suspect his son of greed. He can suspect dishonesty, even theft. Murder is a door the mind refuses to open until someone else puts a hand on the knob. Evelyn began with the money. By noon, she had already found 2 shell corporations tied to property assignments Margaret had marked. Both were registered through the same law office in Delaware. Neither had employees. Neither had a physical headquarters. One existed only as a post office box and a bank relationship. The second was more interesting. It had received nearly $11 million in loans secured against Blackwood properties and moved most of that money within 48 hours of each transaction. Where? I asked. Bermuda. To whom? I don't know yet. She slid 1 page toward me. But this is where it gets strange. Arthur Kane appears on some of the domestic paperwork, Daniel on others. Yet neither man is listed as beneficiary of the offshore trust. Then who is? That's what I'm going to find out. Before she could say more, Samuel's secretary entered the room and handed him a message. He read it twice. Richard, your office called. What happened? Arthur Kane didn't come to work this morning. Arthur never misses work. Samuel's face tightened. Apparently he called his secretary at 6:30 and told her he was sick. Evelyn immediately asked, Did anyone tell him you were in New York? Not from me. Did anyone know you went to the bank? The branch staff. Nathaniel Cole. Daniel knew nothing unless someone called him. She stood. We need Arthur, before Arthur realizes we need him. We flew back to Rhode Island that afternoon and drove directly to Arthur's home outside Providence. His wife answered the door, visibly confused. Arthur had left shortly after breakfast, she said. He told her Richard Blackwood had summoned him to Newport. I had done no such thing. We found his Cadillac 3 hours later in a parking lot near the Providence waterfront. The driver's door was unlocked. His briefcase was gone. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing dramatic enough to explain why the man who had handled my money for 21 years had apparently vanished. On the same morning, we started tracing $48 million. But Evelyn found something beneath the passenger seat, a torn corner of an envelope. On it, written in Arthur's handwriting, were 3 words and a time: Blackwood Manor, 11:30. That night, for the first time since Margaret died, I became afraid to return to my own home, because someone had summoned Arthur there using my name, and whoever had done it knew exactly where I would not be. By the time we reached Blackwood Manor, the sun had dropped behind the trees, and the house looked less like the place I had lived for 37 years than a silhouette cut against the Atlantic. Samuel wanted me to stay in the car until the police arrived. Evelyn disagreed. If whoever summoned Arthur came here looking for something, waiting gives them time to leave with it. I unlocked the front door myself. Nothing appeared disturbed. The lamps were off. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall ticked exactly as it had every night of my marriage. For a moment, I felt foolish for being afraid of my own home. Then Evelyn stopped beside the library door. "Did you leave this open?" I had not. Margaret always kept the library closed because the salt air warped the old books. I pushed the door wider. The room looked normal until I saw my desk. One drawer was open, then another. Papers had been moved, not scattered carelessly, but searched. Whoever had been there knew exactly what they wanted and had tried to leave everything looking untouched. "What was kept here?" Evelyn asked. "Corporate records, old contracts, some family papers. Anything connected to Margaret?" I looked toward a walnut cabinet beside the fireplace. My stomach tightened. Margaret had used the bottom drawer for personal documents. I crossed the room and pulled it open. Empty. "There were letters here," I said. "Insurance files, copies of our wills, Margaret's correspondence." Samuel turned sharply. "Your wills?" I nodded. "Someone took them." Evelyn did not react with surprise. She simply asked, "Who knew they were kept here?" I could think of too many names. Daniel, Arthur, Samuel, Margaret, possibly Vanessa. For years, Blackwood Manor had been treated less like a private home than the unofficial headquarters of the family. People came and went. Documents were signed over dinner. Keys changed hands without anyone thinking twice. Trust had made the house easy to enter. I was beginning to understand that trust had made everything easy. Then we heard a sound from downstairs. A dull metallic knock. Once. Then again. Samuel froze. Evelyn raised one finger and moved toward the hallway. The sound came from beneath us, near the wine cellar and old service rooms. I knew every sound that house made. That was not plumbing. We went down the back staircase. The basement lights were already on. At the end of the corridor, the door to the old coal storage room stood closed. The metallic sound came again from inside. Evelyn opened it. Arthur Kane was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his wrists bound in front of him with electrical cord. His lip was split, one side of his face purple with bruising, but he was alive. When he saw me, relief crossed his face so quickly it looked almost like pain. "Richard." I dropped beside him. "Who did this?" Arthur looked at Evelyn, then Samuel, then me. "Close the door." "Arthur, close it." Evelyn did. Arthur swallowed hard. "I got a call just after 6 this morning. Man said he was calling for you. Said Margaret's papers had been found and you wanted to meet privately before the board heard anything." "Where?" "Here. 11:30. I came through the side entrance. Someone hit me before I reached the library." "Who?" Arthur looked down. I never saw his face. Evelyn crouched beside him. "Then why keep you alive?" Arthur's eyes moved toward me. "Because they wanted something I have." Silence filled the room. "What?" I asked. Arthur closed his eyes. "The original transfer ledger." Samuel swore under his breath. Arthur continued. "Margaret found discrepancies almost a year before she died. She came to me. At first I lied to her. My hands curled into fists. Why? Because I was involved. The words landed harder than I expected, even though every document already pointed toward him. Arthur looked 20 years older sitting on that floor. "Daniel came to me almost 5 years ago. Said he needed temporary liquidity for acquisitions you would never approve. Private opportunities. He wanted to borrow against assets and put the money back before annual reviews. I told myself that was all it was. And you signed? Yes. $48 million. Arthur. It wasn't 48 at first. His voice cracked. It started with 2, then 4. Then once the structure existed, it kept growing. Daniel always had another reason, another deal, another account. Evelyn leaned forward. Who controlled the offshore trust? Arthur's expression changed. Fear, unmistakable, and immediate. I don't know. You expect me to believe that? I know where the instructions came from. I don't know who ultimately owned the account. Where did the instructions come from? Arthur hesitated. Vanessa. My daughter-in-law's name seemed to hang in the room. Vanessa knew? I asked. Arthur gave a bitter laugh. Knew? Richard. She brought Daniel half the structure. The Bermuda lawyers. The holding companies. She knew exactly how to move money where auditors wouldn't see it. For several seconds, I could hear nothing except the furnace. Daniel had betrayed me. Arthur had helped him. Now Vanessa sat behind the money. The family I had built was beginning to look like a conspiracy. But Arthur was not finished. Margaret figured out Vanessa was involved 3 weeks before the accident. She confronted me, told me if I didn't give her everything, she would go directly to federal investigators. Did Daniel know? Arthur stared at the floor. Yes. How? He called me the night before your wife died. Every muscle in my body went still. What did he say? Arthur looked directly at me for the first time. He asked if Margaret had told you yet. I could barely force the words out. And what did you tell him? I said no. Arthur's eyes filled with something that looked like shame. Daniel went quiet. Then he said, Good. Make sure she doesn't. Samuel stepped forward. Those exact words? Arthur nodded. The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I wanted to believe there was another interpretation. A business meaning. A threat to silence her legally. Anything. Then Evelyn asked the question I was too afraid to ask. Where is the original ledger now? Arthur looked toward the ceiling, as if he could see through 2 floors of Blackwood Manor. Margaret took it from me. Where did she put it? She told me she hid it somewhere Daniel would never search, because he hated going there. I knew before Arthur said another word. There was only one place in the house Daniel had avoided since childhood. Margaret's greenhouse behind the east garden. She had spent hours there every morning. Tending roses, Daniel complained, made him sick. We found the ledger 20 minutes later beneath a loose stone under Margaret's potting bench. But it wasn't the ledger that made Evelyn stop breathing. Taped beneath it was a small envelope with one sentence written across the front in Margaret's hand. If Richard has found this, ask him who had my Mercedes the 3 days before I died. I knew exactly who had Margaret's Mercedes 3 days before she died. Daniel. The memory came back so quickly it made me feel sick. Margaret had complained about a grinding noise when she braked coming down Bellevue Avenue, and Daniel had offered to take the car to a garage used by one of Blackwood Coastal's property managers. I remembered teasing him at dinner for finally doing something useful without being asked. Margaret had laughed. Daniel had taken the keys Friday morning. The Mercedes came back Saturday afternoon. Margaret died Sunday night. For 9 months, that sequence had meant nothing to me. Now it felt like Margaret had reached through time and placed the 3 days directly in my hands. Evelyn read the sentence on the envelope twice, then looked at me. Are you sure Daniel had the car? I watched him drive it away. Did he bring it back himself? I thought about it. No. One of the household staff said it had been returned. I never asked who drove it. Arthur was still sitting in the greenhouse doorway, with a blanket around his shoulders, when Evelyn turned to him. Do you know where Daniel took the Mercedes? Arthur hesitated. Not specifically, but Blackwood uses several garages. Margaret wrote this because the answer mattered, Evelyn said. Think. Arthur rubbed both hands across his face. There was one place Daniel used privately, Harbor Auto and Restoration in Fall River. He had a Jaguar service there a few years back. Samuel immediately called a contact with the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles, while Evelyn took the ledger and Margaret's envelope. Within an hour, we had an address. The garage sat behind a row of warehouses near the Taunton River, a low brick building with 3 service bays and a hand-painted sign faded by years of weather. It was almost midnight when we arrived, but Evelyn insisted we not wait until morning. If someone knew Arthur had been taken, they may already know we found him, she said. From this point forward, every hour matters. The owner, a tired man named Leon Mercer, answered the door, wearing work trousers and a white undershirt. He recognized Margaret's name before he recognized mine. "Mrs. Blackwood's Mercedes?" he said. That was a strange job. My chest tightened. What was strange about it? Leon disappeared into an office and returned, carrying a thick invoice book. He found the entry from 9 months earlier. The Mercedes had been brought in Friday morning with instructions to inspect the braking system. According to the work order, the front brake lines had been replaced and the master cylinder checked. Nothing unusual there. Then Leon pointed to a handwritten note at the bottom. Customer requested installation of supplied part. No warranty. What supplied part? Evelyn asked. Leon frowned. A proportioning valve. Customer brought it himself. Said the factory replacement was back-ordered and he'd already sourced one. Who was the customer? I already knew what answer I expected. Leon looked at the carbon copy. Your son signed the authorization. My jaw hardened. Was there anything wrong with the valve? Not when we installed it. Could it have caused brake failure? Evelyn asked. Leon looked uncomfortable. Any hydraulic component can fail if it's defective or modified. But I'm not saying that one was. Do you still have the original part you removed? Scrap gets collected every month. Long gone. Evelyn looked at me. We had a connection, not proof. Daniel had taken Margaret's car to the garage. Daniel had supplied a brake component. Margaret had died when the car failed to negotiate a curve. But 9 months had passed, and the Mercedes itself had been released by the insurance company and sold for salvage after the investigation closed. Or so I believed. Leon cleared his throat. There is one other thing. He turned several pages in the ledger. The bill wasn't paid by your son. Who paid it? A company check. He pointed at the account name written beside the invoice. VHB Consulting. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. Do you have a copy? Leon nodded. Banks returned canceled checks with statements in those days, but he kept photocopies for commercial clients. 10 minutes later, he placed a faded copy under the office lamp. VHB Consulting, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I had never heard the name. Evelyn had. She pulled one of Margaret's documents from her folder and laid it beside the check. VHB Consulting was the registered agent connected to one of the shell entities that had moved Blackwood money offshore. The filing address traced back to Vanessa. For the first time, the pieces appeared to form a single picture. Daniel delivered the car. Vanessa's company paid for the repair. Margaret died 2 days later. Margaret had been investigating them both. That's enough for the police, I said. Evelyn shook her head. Enough to reopen questions. Not enough to accuse anyone of murder. What else do you need? The car. According to the insurance file Samuel obtained the next morning, the Mercedes had not been destroyed. It had been sold at a salvage auction and purchased by a dismantler outside Worcester. By noon, we were standing in a fenced yard surrounded by hundreds of wrecked vehicles, looking at the twisted remains of the car my wife died in. The front end was crushed almost to the windshield. The passenger side was folded inward. I had not seen it since the night of the accident. I almost turned away. Evelyn did not. She brought in a mechanical engineer named Thomas Vale, a former accident investigator who spent 4 hours examining the braking system while I waited in the office drinking coffee that tasted like rust. When he finally came inside, his gloves were black with grease. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "your wife didn't lose control because of the rain." No one spoke. He placed a small metal component on the desk, inside a clear evidence bag. This proportioning valve was altered internally. Someone shaved the retaining shoulder and weakened the spring assembly. It would work normally at first. Then after repeated brake pressure, it could fail without warning. My mouth went dry. Could that happen accidentally? Not like this. So someone sabotaged the brakes. Thomas looked at Evelyn before answering. Someone modified this part intentionally. I stared at the metal valve. Such a small thing. Small enough to hold in one hand. Small enough to kill the woman I had loved for 43 years. Evelyn slid the copy of the VHB Consulting check toward Thomas, then turned to me. Daniel supplied the part. A company tied to Vanessa paid for the work. That gives us a chain. I should have felt certainty. Instead, something bothered me. Margaret had been careful enough to hide evidence in a car, a bank vault, and beneath her greenhouse. If she had suspected Daniel and Vanessa, why ask who had my Mercedes instead of simply naming them? Why leave a question instead of an accusation? That evening, Samuel found the answer hidden in Margaret's ledger. One payment, made 6 days before her death, had been circled 3 times in red ink. It came from VHB Consulting, but the signature authorizing the account transfer did not belong to Vanessa. It belonged to someone who had spent months making sure every document pointed directly at her. And when Evelyn placed the signature beside me, I recognized it immediately. Daniel had signed Vanessa's name. Daniel had signed Vanessa's name. At first I thought Samuel was mistaken. I wanted him to be mistaken, not because I was eager to defend Vanessa, but because every new answer made the shape of the betrayal harder to understand. If Daniel had forged his wife's signature on the payment tied to Margaret's brake repair, then one of two things was true. Either Vanessa knew exactly what he was doing and had allowed him to create distance between herself and the crime, or Daniel had been preparing to blame her long before anyone knew there would be something to blame. Evelyn placed 3 documents side by side on the table in Samuel's office. The payment authorization to Harbor Auto, an older Blackwood acquisition contract Daniel had signed himself, and a corporate filing carrying Vanessa's signature. "Look at the capital V," she said. "Vanessa normally begins it with a narrow downward stroke. This one curves left before it drops. Daniel does the same thing with the D in his own name. The pressure pattern matches his handwriting too." Samuel leaned closer. "You can prove that?" "A document examiner can. I'm telling you what I see before we send it out." I stared at the page. "So Vanessa may not have paid for the part." "Correct. But her company was moving stolen money." "Also correct." "Then what exactly are you saying?" Evelyn looked at me carefully. "I'm saying your son may have been committing crimes with his wife while simultaneously creating evidence he could use against her if the operation ever collapsed." That sentence chilled me more than the bauds. Photographs, the offshore accounts, even the sabotaged brake valve. Greed I understood, panic I understood. Even cowardice had a shape I could recognize. But this was something else. Daniel had not merely been stealing, he had been building exits. The next morning, Evelyn drove to Grand Rapids to confront Vanessa's former accountant. Samuel remained in Newport with Arthur, who had finally agreed to cooperate fully if given legal protection. I stayed at Blackwood Manor because, for the first time in days, there was nowhere else I could go that felt more dangerous than the truth already waiting inside my own house. Just after noon, Samuel brought me an envelope Margaret had placed inside the original transfer ledger. We had missed it because it was tucked into the inner binding. On the front, Margaret had written only one name, Claire. I sat alone in the library for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a telephone number in Boston. "Richard, if this reaches you, then you know enough to understand that we were wrong about our daughter. Claire did not take that money. I tried to prove it before I confronted Daniel, but I waited too long. You will want to blame yourself. Don't waste time doing that. Find her instead. She saw something 4 years ago that frightened Daniel enough to destroy her place in this family. She may be the only person left who knows what it was." I read the letter once, then again. Then I put it down because the words had begun to blur. 4 years earlier, Claire had stood in this same room crying so hard she could barely speak while I accused her of stealing from us. She told me the documents were false. She told me Daniel had access to the account. She told me Margaret believed her. And I told her to leave. Not Daniel, me. That was the memory I had spent 4 years sanding smooth until I could live with it. Margaret had just handed the rough edges back. The telephone number belonged to a small photography studio in Boston. A woman answered. When I asked for Claire Blackwood, there was silence on the line. "Who's calling?" "Her father." Another pause. "She doesn't use that name here." 20 minutes later, Claire came to the phone. I had imagined that moment many times over the years. In some versions, she yelled. In others, she hung up. What she actually said was worse. "What happened to Mom?" My throat closed. "Why would you ask that?" "Because she told me if you ever called, it would mean something had happened to her." I gripped the receiver. "Claire, your mother died 9 months ago. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had disconnected. Then I heard her inhale sharply. No one told me. I closed my eyes. Daniel had arranged Margaret's funeral notices. Daniel had told me he had tried to locate Claire and failed. I thought you knew, I whispered. You thought a lot of things. I deserve that. I told her about Margaret's letters, the offshore money, Arthur, the Rolls-Royce, and finally the altered brake valve. Claire did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Daniel threatened Mom before I left. What? That's what I was trying to tell you 4 years ago. She spoke quietly now, almost without emotion, which somehow made it worse. I found Daniel in Dad's your office after midnight. He was copying signatures from old trust documents. I confronted him. 2 days later, money disappeared from the family account, and suddenly my signature was everywhere. Daniel came to me before you did. He told me if I fought it, Mom would be next. My hand tightened around the phone. Why didn't you tell Margaret? I did. That's why she believed me. Why didn't she tell me? Claire laughed once, bitterly. She tried. You had already decided Daniel was the responsible one, and I was the difficult daughter. Mom told me to leave Boston for a while until she could prove what he was doing. I waited for her call. Eventually, the calls stopped. Claire, I am sorry. I don't need sorry right now. Her voice hardened. I need you to understand something. Daniel didn't frame me because of $200,000. He framed me because I saw a second set of estate documents in your office. I stopped breathing. What estate documents? A revised version of your will. I never revised my will. I know that now. She paused. But the copy I saw transferred controlling interest in Blackwood Coastal to Daniel immediately upon your death. And there was something else attached to it. What? An insurance schedule. My skin went cold. On whose life? Claire answered without hesitation. Yours. That evening, Evelyn returned from Grand Rapids carrying bank records that confirmed what Claire had just told me. 18 months earlier, a corporate life insurance policy worth $12 million had been opened on Richard Blackwood. The beneficiary was not my company. It was a trust, controlled by Daniel. Margaret had not been Daniel's final obstacle. She had simply discovered the plan before he was ready. I was the person the plan had always been built to survive. Once I knew Daniel had taken out a $12 million policy on my life, everything changed. Until that moment, some stubborn part of me had still been trying to separate the son I raised from the man in Margaret's papers. I could tell myself he was greedy. I could tell myself Vanessa had manipulated him. I could even tell myself the brake sabotage had gone further than he intended. But a secret insurance policy on his own father required patience. It required paperwork. It required a future in which I was worth more dead than alive. Samuel wanted the police immediately. Evelyn wanted 48 hours. We have enough to make him nervous, she said, but not enough to make him talk. If Daniel believes the walls are closing in, he'll lawyer up and say nothing. If he believes he's won, he may tell us what we still don't know. And what exactly don't we know? I asked. Whether Margaret's death was planned by Daniel alone, whether Vanessa knew about it, and whether Arthur's abduction was meant to scare him or kill him. I looked toward the window of Samuel's office. Beyond it, Newport Harbor was gray beneath a November sky. Then give him what he wants. Daniel returned from Paris 3 days later. He called me before he reached home, irritated that his office had refused to release certain financial files without my approval. I apologized. That surprised him. Then I told him grief had made me irrational about the Rolls-Royce. I said I had been thinking about retirement. I said Blackwood Coastal needed younger leadership. Most importantly, I told him I wanted to discuss transferring control of the company. The silence on the telephone was different this time. Not annoyed. Hungry. You mean that? Come to the house Friday. We'll talk. Just us? Family only. Daniel arrived at Blackwood Manor at 6:45 wearing a navy suit, carrying a bottle of scotch he knew I liked, and smiling like a son coming home to forgive an aging father. Vanessa came with him, dressed in black, elegant, and watchful. The moment she saw me, I knew Evelyn had been right about one thing. Vanessa was frightened. Daniel was not. He kissed my cheek. I'm glad you came around, Dad. I almost admired the confidence. We ate dinner in the formal dining room where Margaret had hosted Christmas for 30 years. Daniel spoke about restructuring the company as if the transfer had already happened. He wanted to sell 2 hotels, refinance the Boston properties, expand into Manhattan, remove legacy staff who were too expensive. Vanessa barely touched her food. Twice I caught her looking at Daniel instead of me. After dessert, I led them into the library. On the table sat a leather folder Samuel had prepared. Inside were documents that appeared to transfer temporary voting control of Blackwood Coastal Holdings to Daniel, pending a formal board vote. They were not legally effective. Daniel did not know that. He read the first page and smiled. This is the right move. Your mother would disagree. His eyes lifted. Only for a second. Mom worried about everything, especially you. Vanessa went still. Daniel closed the folder. What is this? I walked to Margaret's old desk and placed the brass key from box 317 on the wood, then the cassette tape, then a photocopy of the brake repair invoice, then the forged VHB payment. Daniel's face did not collapse the way I expected. It hardened. You went through Mom's things. Your mother wanted me to. Dad, whatever Arthur told you, he's trying to save himself. Arthur told me you called him before Margaret died. Daniel glanced at Vanessa. Arthur is a thief. So are you. The room went silent. I continued. $47.8 million borrowed against company property. Offshore transfers. Shell companies. Claire framed for theft. A forged will. $12 million of insurance on my life. Vanessa turned toward Daniel slowly. What insurance? He ignored her. That was the first mistake. You knew nothing about it? I asked. Vanessa stared at him. Daniel? He snapped. Not now. Her expression changed. Not guilt. Recognition. You told me the trust was for estate planning. Daniel stood. Dad, you're confused. Samuel's filling your head with nonsense because he knows if I take over, he's gone. Sit down. I'm done with this. No. You're finally going to finish it. I pressed the button on the cassette player. Margaret's voice filled the library. Weak at first, then unmistakable. Richard, if you're hearing this, I have reason to believe Daniel has been altering company records and using Vanessa's corporate accounts to move money. But I don't believe Vanessa knows everything he has put in her name. Daniel has started preparing documents that make her responsible if the transfers are discovered. Vanessa's face drained of color. Daniel lunged toward the cassette player. Evelyn stepped through the library doorway before he reached it. Samuel entered behind her. Then Claire. Daniel froze when he saw his sister. Claire looked different from the girl he had pushed out 4 years earlier. Older, harder, completely unafraid of him. You should have stayed in Boston, Daniel said. Claire answered, That's what you told me the first time. Vanessa backed away from her husband. What did you put in my name? Daniel said nothing. Evelyn laid another file on the table. The payment for the modified brake valve, the offshore entities, several transfer authorizations, all designed to point to Mrs. Blackwood, if anyone investigated. Vanessa looked at him as though she were seeing a stranger. You were going to blame me. Vanessa, don't be stupid. Did you kill Margaret? That question broke something in him. Daniel's face changed not into fear, but rage. She wouldn't stop. Nobody moved. He realized too late what he had said. Vanessa whispered, What? Daniel looked around the room and finally understood. The transfer papers, the family dinner, my apology. None of it had been real. He had walked willingly into the only meeting of his life where he did not control the outcome. She was going to destroy everything, he said, quieter now. Everything I built. I stared at my son. You built nothing. His jaw tightened. I spent 20 years waiting for you to die so I could finally run the company without asking permission for every breath I took. Claire closed her eyes. Vanessa stepped farther away, and from the hallway came a voice Daniel had not heard yet. That's enough. 2 federal investigators entered the library with a Newport police detective behind them. Daniel looked at me then, not at the officers, not at Evelyn, at me. You called the police on your own son? I walked toward him and stopped where Margaret's chair used to sit. No, Daniel. Your mother did. It just took me 9 months to hear her. Her man. Daniel did not leave Blackwood Manor in handcuffs that night. Not immediately. The investigators wanted statements, documents, bank records, and something stronger than a frightened wife and a dead woman's cassette before they made the kind of arrest that would survive a courtroom. But by sunrise, every major Blackwood coastal account had been frozen. Daniel's executive authority had been suspended, and federal agents were carrying boxes of records out of offices he had once walked through as if he already owned them. Vanessa lasted less than 24 hours before she asked for her own attorney. By the end of the second day, she was cooperating. She admitted helping Daniel move money through offshore companies, but she insisted she had believed the first transfers were temporary financing schemes designed to hide risky investments from me. That excuse did not make her innocent. It did, however, explain why Daniel had spent years placing forged signatures, false authorizations, and shell company paperwork in her name. He had not married a partner. He had built himself an exit. Vanessa gave investigators the key to a Manhattan apartment Daniel had rented under another corporation. Inside a locked cabinet, they found copies of my forged will, the $12 million life insurance policy, duplicate corporate seals, blank letterhead from 3 banks, and a folder containing photographs of Margaret's Mercedes taken before the accident. The final item in that folder destroyed whatever part of me still wanted to believe my son had only intended to frighten his mother. It was a handwritten note from Daniel to a mechanic who had disappeared from Massachusetts 2 weeks after Margaret died. The note did not say, "Kill her." Men like Daniel rarely write the important words down. It said, "The failure must look natural." No second inspection. The mechanic was found 3 months later living under his brother's name in Florida. He testified that Daniel paid him $15,000 in cash to alter the brake component before it was delivered to Harbor Auto. Vanessa knew nothing about that payment. Arthur knew nothing about it. Daniel had acted alone. Margaret had not died because she happened to discover the fraud. She died because my son believed she was standing between him and the life he thought he deserved. The trial began the following spring. By then, newspapers from Boston to New York had turned the Blackwood name into something people whispered over breakfast. Reporters waited outside the courthouse every morning. They wanted photographs of me, Claire, Vanessa, anyone whose grief could be converted into a headline. I gave them nothing. I sat in the same seat every day and watched strangers explain my family back to me in exhibits, signatures, transfer schedules, and testimony. Vanessa pleaded guilty to conspiracy and financial fraud in exchange for cooperation. Arthur did the same. Daniel took everything to trial. He said the money movements were authorized business decisions. He said Vanessa had manipulated the offshore accounts. He said Arthur was lying to save himself. He even suggested Margaret had become paranoid before her death. That was the moment I stopped mourning the son I thought I had raised. A man can lie about money. He can lie about a crime. But listening to Daniel attack his dead mother because she could no longer defend herself burned away whatever remained between us. The jury convicted him on every major count, including conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, forgery, insurance fraud, and charges connected to Margaret's death. When the judge sentenced him, Daniel finally turned around and looked at me. For months he had avoided my eyes. That morning he stared directly at me, as if there were still one final argument he could win. "Dad," he said before the marshals moved him away, "you're giving everything to Claire, aren't you? Not, 'I'm sorry.' Not, 'I loved Mom.' Not even, 'Forgive me.'" He wanted to know who got the company. I stood and answered the only way I could. "Daniel, that is still the only thing you understand." He was sentenced to decades in federal prison. Vanessa received a substantially shorter sentence because of her cooperation. Arthur lost his career, his reputation, and several years of his freedom. Nearly $39 million was eventually recovered through frozen accounts, seized property, and settlements. The rest was gone. I could have spent the following years chasing every missing dollar. Instead, I decided Daniel had already taken enough time from this family. I brought Claire home, not as an heir, not, at first, as my daughter. The first night she slept at Blackwood Manor again, I stood outside her old bedroom for almost 5 minutes before I found the courage to knock. I apologized for believing documents over my own child, for allowing Daniel to turn my pride into a weapon, and for letting 4 years pass without finding her. Claire did not forgive me immediately. I did not ask her to. Real forgiveness should never arrive merely because the person who caused the damage finally feels guilty. It came slowly, in breakfasts, long drives, uncomfortable conversations, and eventually laughter I had not heard in that house since Margaret was alive. A year later, Claire joined the board of Blackwood Coastal Holdings. 3 years later, when I finally stepped down, the board elected her chairwoman unanimously. She did not inherit the company because Daniel went to prison. She earned the right to lead it because she understood something Daniel never did. Owning something and deserving it are not the same thing. I used a portion of the recovered money to establish the Margaret Blackwood Foundation, dedicated to helping older adults and families who had been victims of financial exploitation by people they trusted. Margaret had spent the final year of her life following numbers because she believed protecting a family sometimes meant being willing to discover what was wrong with it. I wanted her name attached to that courage, not to the way she died. And then there was the Rolls-Royce. Cole and Mercer kept it in New York until the investigation released it. The day I brought it back to Newport, Claire rode beside me. We said almost nothing on the drive. When we reached Blackwood Manor, I parked in the same garage where the story had begun. 4 pale tire marks were still faintly visible on the concrete. I sat behind the wheel for a while, my hands resting where Margaret's had rested thousands of times. Claire looked at me and asked, "Do you think Mom knew you'd find everything?" I looked at the red leather seat, the polished dashboard, and the place beneath the rear cushion where she had hidden the first piece of truth. "No," I said. "I think she was afraid I wouldn't." Claire was quiet. Then I smiled for the first time that day. "But your mother always did plan for my stubbornness. Daniel once told me everything would eventually belong to him anyway. In a strange way, he was right about inheritance. We all inherit something. Money, names, mistakes, sometimes consequences. My son spent years trying to inherit my company before I was dead. In the end, the only thing I left him was the full weight of what he had done. Margaret left me something better. The truth. Claire left me something I had no right to expect. Another chance. And at 72 years old, I finally understood the lesson I should have learned long before betrayal walked into my home wearing my son's face. Blood can make someone family, but only character decides whether they deserve to remain one.